Right, greetings, hello. So, yes, this isn't my normal philosophy club meeting. This is an extra talk, short talk I'm giving about democracy as a public good. And I've been asked to give this to a group that I attend, organised by Sam Petroda, an Indian technologist and digital genius who lives in Chicago but has helped lay the infrastructure for India's technical revolution with Rajiv Gandhi, the former Prime Minister, as his close colleague. They kind of masterminded this together, which has laid the infrastructure for India's role as the superpower in the cyber world, effectively. But, Sam Petroda is very worried about the drift away from democracy, the sort of intellectual idea that absolutism or sort of neo-fascism or some kind of Hindu fascism is the route that India should go down, as opposed to the secularism that's enshrined in the constitution written by Ambedkar and embodying the kind of multicultural idea of India, that India should be open for business to all peoples. Hindus, yes, of course, but also Muslims, of which there are many, many hundreds of millions in India, as well as Jains and Sikhs, of course, and many Christians in India, and there are still some Buddhists and so on, and many, many secular humanists and philosophers and so on. So, and of course scientists. I mean, Nehru wanted a scientific temper for India, as he put it. So what is this idea about democracy as a public good? Now, this is something that the leader of the Congress Party, Rahul Gandhi, has been going to the West to talk to academic experts about. And so I'm just putting in my little pennyworth here into that discussion. Because I think it's important not just for India, but for the wider world. Democracy is a public good globally, but it's taken a beating in the last few years, and I'm going to explain how that happened and why, and what are the anti-democratic forces. That's by way of preamble. Also to say that Sam Petroda is co-chair of the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum that I chair, and he's helping run our Global Good Governance Commission, which is very important. So we have an interest in the bigger picture here globally. And we're looking at what democracy can do in the way of, reviving its raison d'etre in the face of anti-democratic attacks. And I'm going to be trying to explain that. So this is me with my kind of political philosophy hat on, which is one of the subjects I taught and studied at university. So the idea that democracy is a public good, well, that's got a very long and complex history. Really, we have to take that back to ancient Greece and the time of Athenian democracy. Athens was the democratic power in the ancient world, regarded as the birthplace of democracy. Citizens had a direct role in decision-making and governance. They all voted. It was a small enough state that all citizens could, have a direct role. And so the notion that democracy is a public good emerged at that time in Athens from the idea that collective participation in political affairs and decision-making promoted the common good of society. I think the most notable enunciation of this idea is that of Pericles, who was this great statesman of democracy in Athens at a time when it was under attack from Sparta, which took an anti-democratic position. And I'll be looking at that a bit later, tragically. Athens defended itself, and it was the first sort of ideological war, if you want, between democracy on the one hand and totalitarianism on the other. Sparta was a monarchy, dual monarchy, and it didn't have much time or respect for Athens with its democratic decision-making. It felt that, and it was also, it was ruled by a tiny minority of people who ruled Sparta with brutality and military intelligence. They ran a thing called the Cryptia, which was a secret service in Sparta that kept the mass of the people, the helots, in service to the small elite who were like a militarized warrior caste. The Cryptia used to go around Sparta and listen in to conversations in cafes and public squares, and anyone that spoke out against the government was then secretly killed off by them. I mean, the Cryptia was not, it was like the worst ever possible secret service, a bit like, Stalin's NKVD at the height of the terror. Anyone that spoke out against Stalin was just killed off. That's what the Cryptia used to do. Now, Athens didn't do that. They believed in values of liberty of speech and freedom of thought and so on. And Pericles gave an oration to the dead who died in the Athenian struggle against Sparta, knowing what was at stake. It's the forerunner of Lincoln's great Gettysburg Address, because Pericles says, look, I'm not going to enunciate all their great heroic qualities, and I'm not going to sing their praises, because every Athenian knows what they died for. And we stand for democracy and freedom of thought because we believe that it enhances culture. It gives meaning to life. It gives purpose and a sense of beauty. And because we're free people, so we flourish in the arts, in literature, in history, in poetry, in music. Pericles himself was a great supporter of all those and a great patron of the arts. He was friends with Aspasia, who was his consort, who was friends with Plato's mother. He was a great friend of Anaxagoras, another great philosopher who was in Athens at the time, one of the first philosophers to propose that there's a divine intelligence, nous, that organizes matter into creative ways that make life meaningful. He also proposed the theory of panspermia, that life exists not just here but on other worlds throughout the universe. And were he alive now, I'm sure he'd be doing exobiology tests and so on. So that's the kind of intellectual Pericles was, and this funeral oration that came down in the works of Thucydides, one of the two great founders of history, which is my discipline, along with Herodotus, they both went to Athens, and Herodotus read out his famous histories in public. That was how you did things. Now we do a kind of YouTube talk. And Thucydides, who was a general in the Athenian struggle against Sparta briefly, he wrote up the history of that war. And in that he puts this famous oration of Pericles. So it's a masterpiece. I recommend everybody should read it. If you want to know what democracy feels like, what it's about, why it matters, read Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides. Although Sparta won the war, because they managed to defeat Athens militarily, there were tragedies, plagues. Pericles himself died of a plague. It was a nightmare time. Culturally, I think Athens won that war, and that's why democracy still lives on, a flame of freedom and reason, so to say, that's been handed down the centuries. I want to talk briefly about Roman democracy, because Rome also had a democracy. It had a Senate, which was for the aristocracy, the wealthy, the elites of Roman society. But it also had a sort of popular assembly for the plebeians who had representation and who had the institution of the tribune, which was there to give voice to the concerns of the lower classes, working classes we call them. And they were valued in Rome. And they had a sacred temple. They had particular deities, Liber, the god of freedom, who was also equated to Bacchus, the god of ecstasy and wine, because people like a glass of wine at the end of a hard day's work. And so the plebs loved Liber, and you'll find out all about Liber in my Tarot of the Gods, where I've done a kind of critique and study of all the gods of all religions. in the form of tarot pack, and Liber is a very honoured card in that, and you'll read about his role in Roman democracy. That morphed into what I will call Christian democracy, and I'm talking initially about Europe here. Europe as a sort of bastion of democracy. Christ's mission, whatever you think of Christ and however you interpret what he was doing, and there are so many studies, and there are many different Christs, plural, as theologians have said. He was democratizing enlightenment. He was trying to get it out of this focus on the temple cult in Jerusalem, and this sort of racial kind of approach to you can only find God if you're Jewish and you have the right ancestry and your life conforms to everything that's in the scriptures. Christ was definitely what we would call a radical democrat. He was trying to bring gnosis, bring the kingdom of God, bring that spiritual knowledge into the hands of ordinary people. Not just the kind of the hierarchy of the priesthood in Jerusalem. And a very recent book, which is very important, by Brian Murarescu, called The Immortality Key, has documented something about what Christ was actually doing and how he was doing it. What he's discovered, which is very interesting, is that early Christians sort of morphed from early Dionysian followers. In the Greek world of classical antiquity, Dionysus was the god of the common people. He was the god of the farmers, the people that did the work. And because he was the god of ecstasy, release, the party time that we all look forward to on a Friday or Saturday night in Europe. And he was also the god who he turned up mysteriously at night with a sort of procession of torches. The Maenads would follow Dionysus, and they would promise joy. And the Dionysian mysteries, there's a villa in Pompeii that paint these, were ecstatic. And what Brian Murarescu has done, he's an American classical scholar, is discovered that they were using a psychedelic, a mind-revealing potion in a form of spiced wine, because Dionysus was the god of wine, but wine in those days was far stronger than it is now, and it had psychedelic qualities. Well, that fits with Athens and Pericles, because all Athenians used to go to the mysteries in Eleusis, 14 miles outside Athens. I've been there myself to the archaeological remains. And Pericles was a patron of the mysteries, and Athens was in general. And he himself went, and so did Plato, so did Aristotle. All the greatest intellectuals of Greece went to the mysteries once only in their lifetime. And they took a psychedelic potion which basically the ego dies and the kingdom of God is revealed. I mean, your soul realizes it's immortal. It predates the body. It predates this incarnation. And it's the real thing that we are. And the Romans used, after they sort of took over the banner of Hellenism, they went to the mysteries. The Emperor Hadrian went, Marcus Aurelius, all the great intellectuals. Cicero said it was the most important thing Greece had ever given to humanity. That's quite a thing to say, and Cicero was the wisest Roman philosopher and a great democrat. He was a true Roman democrat, a republican, we would call these people. They believed in the republic. Public affairs are important. And Cicero said of the mysteries, these are the most important, precious gifts Greece has given to humanity. Why? Because it gave us our souls. It gave us our gnosis, our self-knowledge of our immortality. Once you've done the mysteries, you don't need to repeat them. It's not a party trick. Alcibiades got in trouble with the Athenian state because he was trying to do a party trick. No, you just do the mysteries once. They're so profound. Once you've got that lesson, that's it. You don't need to keep resitting the exam. It's like when you passed your exam and you got a first at Oxford. You don't keep saying, well, I want to do it again. No, you did it. That's it. So what Christ was doing, according to Murarescu, was then extending that insight, that knowledge to the common people with the sacraments. and this is what it meant when it said in the Gospel of John, which is the key text for this. This is the blood of God. These early Christians saw Christ as Dionysus, as the one that sets free, the liberator, Liber, because Liber is the same as Bacchus, is the same as Dionysus in Rome. That radical interpretation of Christianity never went away. That lived on in the Gnostic Church, and it's resurfaced among the intellectuals of Christianity ever since. The greatest intellectuals of Christianity have always been not just Democrats, but let's call them epistemological Democrats, because they believe that each of us is entitled to know these mysteries and secrets. It's not just for a priesthood, which may have the duty of wearing the robes and swinging the incense. Yeah, that's fine. Somebody's got to do that. But it's the intellectual priesthood, the epistemological democracy of those who've seen the kingdom of heaven. And this is what is known as the priesthood of all believers. Now, this idea has never gone away. It surfaced in the 12th century in the Italian city-states when republicanism became important again as a political philosophy. And after the Dark Ages, when pretty much it had been pretty brutal and warrior bands were running around, like this thug in Russia, the Wagner people, gradually society reasserted its right to have ordered affairs. And so Siena painted good governance on its fresco, which I've seen. And Florence developed an advanced democracy, as did Venice. And even in the Roman hierarchy of the Vatican, a democracy was involved because they were electing the popes. The cardinals were a democratic body who collectively elected the next pope. So, and in the Protestant era, 16th, 17th, 18th century, that idea of Christian democracy also flourished. In Holland, in Britain, the Quakers were very democratic in their way of acting. The Anglican Church is run by a sort of, a States General that makes decisions, although it's under the monarch of the day, and it's a democracy in a sense, a spiritual democracy. It's a priesthood of all believers, and you get the same with the Baptists and all the other forms of Christianity. So, and that's all influenced political democracy. It should never be underestimated, its importance. During the Enlightenment era, those ideas took root here in France and in Britain. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, this idea that we're entitled to gnosis, to knowledge, to wisdom, to enlightenment, spread like wildfire. And philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu here in France all developed this idea of democracy as a public good. And it went hand in hand with the ideas of science, because if we're free to investigate, let's say like Galileo, the shape of the heavens, or as they started doing in Holland, the size and structure of cells using the microscope, who should control this knowledge? Well, that's where the scientific revolution came about. Let's look at the evidence, the facts, not to some pre-existing theories. Let's actually look at the evidence. And so science then also became part of that public good that is democracy. And the idea that truth is really what's underlying this notion of democracy as a public good. And science became a way of formalizing and validating the pursuit of truth. Empiricism, as in the hands of Locke and co., meant that let's find a way of monitoring, evaluating, and validating truth. But of course, Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, and others at the time in the 18th century wanted to do that in the political world. Is it all just sort of relative opinions, or is there some sort of moral truth that we can nail down here? Well, the moral truth is that the government should work for the the happiness of the citizenship, the well-being of the people, became the established idea of the Enlightenment era. Helvetius and others, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson in America took this idea that the purpose of government is to forge happiness for the people. Now this was from Aristotle, who was really the founder of political science, and a great intellectual, whose ideas had never died away. They came back in the Enlightenment period. And so democracy provides individual freedoms, said these people, and it protects human rights and allows citizens to participate in decision making. So education went hand in hand with these Enlightenment ideas, because an ill-educated citizenship can't exercise its function of democracy properly. It can be swayed easily into becoming like a mob that just votes for, whoever bribes them with the most trinkets. So a properly educated citizenship is essential to the proper functioning of democracy. And that, in turn, contributes to the overall welfare of society. So these flourished and came to fruition politically during the American and French Revolutionary periods, and during the long 19th century, when democratic revolutions took place in other European countries and elsewhere in Latin America and elsewhere. So the American Revolution was premised on this idea. They rejected monarchy and kind of absolute government by a foreign monarch, because they wanted the freedom to choose their own path, their own destiny. And they believed that democracy was the best tool for that. So you have the fascinating period of the making of the American Constitution, where that was enshrined into a written text. And constitutional democracy then became, the touchstone, and still is in many ways, of authentic democratic republicanism. And government by the people and for the people became the leitmotif of this idea. Of course, it hasn't always lived up to it, and it's gone through severe tests over the issue of slavery under Lincoln, and did the states have a right to independence and so on. These were huge tests for America, but it came through them with a new found belief that the government not only has a right for the well-being and happiness of a minority, the rich, the whites, but also for everybody, the slaves as well, whatever the colour of your skin or the type of your religion. The American Constitution is there to serve everybody. And the pursuit of happiness is enshrined in the Constitution, in the words of Thomas Jefferson. Now, those ideas are pretty radical, and they came over to France, of all the states in Europe. We adopted it the most eagerly. And the French realised that they weren't going to be able to get very far without a change of the ancien regime, because the monarchy was so embedded with this idea of noblesse oblige and the rich elites around the country with all kinds of old-style taxes and things, that what was needed was a clean break. And so the French Revolution took place and enshrined democracy in the National Citizens' Assembly. There were problems with the French Revolution, obviously, because, egos get involved, personal vendettas, and one of the difficulties of what you do with revolutionary democracy is what do you do with elites, what do you do with the aristocracy. And there were intellectual elites in France, highly civilized country. It was also complicated by the role of Freemasons, which were important in both the American and French Revolution, who in a sense they were radical elite democrat intellectuals. And in France, they'd organised the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris. Some of the greatest thinkers and philosophers in France were members, like Condorcet and Lavoisier and so on. But Robespierre, who was never a member, he seized power politically, illegitimately, in my opinion, and became a sort of revolutionary mobocrat, and declared war on the intelligentsia within France. And he had Lavoisier and loads of other intellectuals killed off. I mean, that to me as an intellectual is where democracy lets the show down. It becomes a fake democracy, which turns on intellectuals and kills them off in the name of, the people. Well, no, that's the name of bestiality and mobs, which had happened to Socrates. I'm a Democrat, but I'm also a believer that there have to be ethical values underpinning the democracy. And the killing of Socrates by, an Athenian democratic assembly's vote is not truth. The touchstone to me is of ethical duty and truth. But anyway, fortunately, forces saw off the Robespierre nonsense, and he himself was eventually guillotined. But it led to a lot of soul searching in Europe. What kind of democracy do we want? The British model was, let's have a constitutional democracy. Let's keep a sort of figurehead monarchy. Keep an aristocracy in the House of Lords, but have a democracy in the House of Commons. Let's have the best of all three worlds. This actually fitted with Aristotle's idea of that you need a bit of monarchy, a bit of aristocracy, and a bit of democracy, and they should all keep check on each other, so that no one takes absolute power. That was one solution, which I think, as a British citizen, I was brought up to think that's probably quite a good idea. It's taken a hell of a toll recently with the Johnson Conservative Brexit government gaming the system. I'll come back to that in a minute. I think we now in Britain absolutely need a written constitution to prevent that kind of nonsense ever again. But great democrat thinkers developed during the 19th century. John Stuart Mill in Britain. Alexis de Tocqueville went from from France to study in America how democracy actually works. It's a very interesting study he did. The philosopher John Dewey in America, argued that democracy is very important, this pragmatist tradition, because it promotes social welfare and protects individual liberties. Also, it allows for the peaceful resolution of conflicts through political participation. This was Dewey's idea, which is very sensible, and why democracy is a public good. And many other great, theorists of democracy have arisen during the 19th and 20th centuries. Let's just look briefly at, rivals to democracy, because, as I said, Sparta never thought this was a good idea. They were a military state run by the Cryptia. Unfortunately, Bolshevism took ideas from Sparta, and Marx himself was, in the end of his life, living in, Swiss cottage in London, was essentially a parliamentary democrat who believed that socialism could come through the ballot box. He did realise that in Britain Parliament functioned as the mouthpiece for the people, but he was very sceptical, because obviously capital runs a lot of things behind the scenes, and what looks like democracy might just be, the rule by the capitalist elites. So his ideas, I think, were taken and distorted in Russia and led to Bolshevism and Stalinism and Leninism, who did a Robespierre. They seized power illegitimately, and they then imposed their will on the Russian masses through the power of the gun and the power of the secret police. So they did a Sparta, a Cryptia. And for decades, Russia suffered a kind of Robespierre plus Cryptia tyranny. And so this is the complete opposite of democracy as a public good. Democracy becomes like a kind of a whip to torture intellectuals with, and so-called dissidents. And then, unfortunately, the same thing happened in the fascist and Nazi interlude in European history. Again, a complete rejection of liberalism and democracy, and a kind of very cynical use of democracy to seize power by Hitler, but then passing legislation to make sure that he could never be challenged, suspending the constitution, suspending human rights, and instituting a police state and the concentration camp system. And Mussolini had done the same in Italy and Franco in Spain. So the fascist and Nazi attack on democracy was from within, subverting normal channels of governance and then passing laws to silence the opposition. And it was a shocking period in Europe, which we had to live through. I've been to the concentration camps, museums at Dachau, where many of the political opposition were arrested and killed, and Auschwitz and elsewhere. What went along with this was the politics of othering. So these false democrats, these pseudo-social, Nazis, they stole their power by blaming the other. And the other was the Jew or the Freemason or, the black or the gypsy. Anyone that was slightly different, the Jehovah's Witness, which created this sort of mob mentality in Germany. And Hannah Arendt and others talked about the rise of totalitarianism. They saw this. This is fake democracy. It's about hatred. It's a democracy so-called based on hate, the othering of people, the Jews or whatever. And that led to these tragic attacks on what is authentic democracy in Germany and in Nazi territory across Europe. They hated Freemasonry because it was the intellectual wing of democracy. It had been since the 1600s. It was a Christian esoteric brotherhood that defended human rights and the right to assembly and freedom of speech everywhere from Scotland to Holland to New England to France and so on. So these anti-democratic thinkers wanted to destroy it, and whenever they found a Freemason, they sent them to the concentration camps and had them killed off. Freemasonry was also a home for any religion. You could be a Jewish or Sikh or Buddhist or Christian or Hindu and still be welcome to the lodge. And the British Empire acted as a kind of haven for this idea of democratic liberalism. And Freemasonry in India was very important. The grandfather of Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was the Grand Master of the Lodge in Bengal. And Freemasonry was very important for the era of the British Raj. And it fostered a sense of camaraderie and interfaith tolerance in India, as it did in Palestine and Egypt and wherever these lodges spread. From Scotland, that was an important haven of Freemasonry. In fact, it might well have been the cradle of Freemasonry. Certainly here in France, Chevalier Ramsay was initiated in Scotland. And the French Masonic tradition looked to Scotland as their founders. So these ideas are really important. But the challenges, the hatred of Judaism, the hatred of Freemasons and the hatred of democracy, sadly then spread into China with Maoism, which was a protege of Stalinism. I mean, Mao was funded and equipped and armed by Russian agents who were bringing Bolshevik methodology to Mao, who was essentially a petty bandit leader living in the mountains, who lived through terrorizing the local villagers and killing off anyone that opposed him. Not a nice person, a very nasty piece of work if you read a proper biography of Mao in his early years. Intellectually, he was a total cynic, a nihilist, had no sense of values. He was a Buddhist who lost his faith. He didn't believe in the Dharma, believed in nothing at all apart from power.